Welcome everybody to our KuppingerCole Webinar, The Perils of Today's Approach on Access Governance. Start protecting data at source. This webinar is supported by Seclor, and the speakers today are Vishal Gupta, who is CEO of Seclor, and me, Martin Kuppinger. I'm Principal Analyst at KuppingerCole. Before we start, some quick information about one of the services KuppingerCole provides and some housekeeping, and then we directly will dive into the topic. The service I'd like to highlight today is our KC Masterclass. We just are launching the third topic. We have privileged access management, we have incident response. We will right now start an IAM Essential Masterclass. This can be all interactive and remote, so interactive webinars, a lot of material you get, videos and other stuff to learn, certification, and we optionally then have an all-day classroom, either remote or inside, depending on what suits best to what you need and what suits best into the current time. So we have some very interesting new offers here. Have a look at these masterclasses. You'll find all the information on our website. For the webinar itself, some information, audio control. You don't need to mute or unmute yourself. We are controlling these features. We are doing a recording of the webinar. So we will publish a podcast recording usually by the day after the webinar. And we will make also the slide decks available short time. And there will be a Q&A session by the end of the webinar. However, you can enter questions at any time during the webinar. The GoToWebinar control panel, which usually is at the right side of your screen, there's an area questions, and in that area you can enter the questions you have. The more questions we have, the more lively and interesting the Q&A will be at the end. The webinar itself is split into three parts. In the first part, I'll talk about rescoping access governance and about the role of data-centric security in future identity management and access governance. I also will have a look at regulations that drive the need for data-centric security. Following me, Vishal Gupta of Seclor will compare data-centric security to other technologies and look at how to do data-centric security right, with a specific emphasis on the role of the human factor and approaches for efficient policy management. Finally, there will be a Q&A. As I've already said, so I will look at your questions you have and provide answers to these questions. Having said this, I'll directly jump to the first slide of my content. And I think this is maybe the most important in the sense of really talking about and looking at why is data at the core of protection. So let's start very central with that. And when we look at data, whichever type of data it is, at the end, data is what we want to protect. That's a data protection or an information protection. If you distinguish between data and information, that would be a separate topic, probably making this distinction between these two things. But both data and information protection, at the end, it's about how can we protect this valuable data, the valuable information we own. So, and the logical thing to do is protect data at the core. So look at how can you protect the data itself. A quick question to my team. I got two questions whether audio is working. It appears that we might have an audio problem. Levin, can you give me an indicator whether you can hear me? Okay, it looks that it works right now. Then I'll continue. Data is at the core of the protection. So I started talking with we need to look at data security, because data and information is what we really want to protect. This is the essential thing, and the best way to protect data is really starting with protection at that level, protecting data at the core. That's the logical way. We can add layers around it, and we do it We do it regularly, and it's a very normal thing to do. That means we can add a layer which is about protecting our systems and our applications. So all the access controls we have, role management, stuff like that, is an additional layer, but it's not directly protecting the data. It's something we do around it, and it's not the core of the protection. It's an additional layer. The same holds true for network security, protecting people from fraudulently accessing systems. It's another layer. And finally, device and endpoint security is again another layer. All of these help us in information protection, but the logical place to start with information protection obviously is starting at the level of the data, at the level of information. And when we look at it from this perspective, it's apparent that data-centric security is the best way to protect our information. When we look at it, then from a perspective of access governance, as it's usually done today, there are some, I would phrase, some gaps. So access has many facets, and access governance could be pretty broad. So if you look at how access governance could be defined, it becomes apparent that we could look at access governance for static access entitlements and system services applications versus the runtime access. So those are facets of access: static access, entitlement, runtime access. So when I access a system, when I authenticate, when I authorize in runtime, these are again two different things. That is one perspective. The other would be looking at which entitlements do I have. Both is in some way around access governance. It could be around structured data versus big data, so all the data lake stuff versus unstructured data. Different perspectives, different challenges. And we have this, let's start by the right, from access to the device, access to the network, access to the system, to applications and services, access to data and information. Again, this is a perspective we could take around access governance. Privileged versus non-privileged access. Then we have access policies. We could look at implementing these policies, managing these policies, enforcing these policies, on-premise versus cloud, etc. It's a broad spectrum of access governance, but when we look at, and if you take this, it would be a picture, maybe something like that, where we say, okay, we have from the right end, device, network, system, application, data, and we have some policy management, and we have the deployment models, and we have access management, which could be privileged or non-privileged when we read from the left-hand side. The dynamic access, the static entitlements, authentication versus authorization versus usage. A complex picture. In a broad definition, access governance would cover all. And that should, and what we just learned in the beginning, include data governance. However, when we look at what access governance commonly does today, it looks a little bit like that. It's the green area. So static entitlements at systems and applications, done very good on premises, done okay for the cloud. And all the other areas are not in the standard access governance approach of IGA, identity governance and administration. And specifically these two, so the columns number 2 and 3, when we read it from the left-hand side, data, structured, unstructured, that's not covered. But our main focus should be on protecting information. We best do it by protecting information. So access governance and so also access management, the way we do it today, does not cover it at the level it should cover our most sensitive assets, which are our data. For most businesses today, this is one of the most valuable assets of the entire organization. So the traditional focus is very narrow, and we should broaden that scope. And that means we should move to an approach which takes far more emphasis on data-centric security. Factually, we should move to an approach which covers all of that. An approach which looks at all the areas here. So we need the policy management for access policies across everything. We need obviously cybersecurity technologies to protect access to devices and networks. We need a governance for at the system and application level, but we specifically should put our focus on the green area. We should put our focus on data access governance and data-centric security, because that should be at the heart of what we do in access governance. At the end, again, it is about protecting the most valuable assets, the crown jewels of our organizations, and doing that starts at the data, at the information level, and not somewhere in one of these sort of outer layers, such as the device, the network, or applications and systems. That doesn't mean we should get rid of the other stuff. We need all, but we need to take a broader approach on security, with data-centric security being a core discipline of everything we are doing. And that's also required when we look at it from an audit perspective, when we look at it from a security perspective and from a compliance perspective, which are different things. So compliance only means we are meeting the laws and regulations. We could even say, yes, when we comply with that, and audit only says, yes, we passed. We can prove it historically, but it doesn't mean that we are really safe. And I've seen too much checkbox compliance in my life already. We need to move to something which really helps us. And having a compliance or an audit check and saying, okay, yes, we've passed it, doesn't help us when valuable data gets lost. It doesn't help us. It doesn't help us when data leaks. So we need to do it right. So we need to take the right actions. And so doing things the right way. Audit compliance are tightly related, but they don't make us secure. Let's take the right actions. And that means think beyond the check of saying, okay, we've passed our ISO 27000 certification. We've passed our audits, whatever, in a financial industry organization, and got the checks. We should do it in a way which makes us really proof for the future. And that means we need to add data-centric security, again, because it's at the core. And there are also a lot of regulations which have some element of data-centric security already in, and there will be more. I'm absolutely convinced we will see far more audits looking at these aspects. When we look at the baseline, not only regulations, but also the standards, so ISO 27000 is not a regulation, it's a standard. But factually, it's not only asking for protecting the system, it's also asking for protecting the data. Look at these standards, look at these requirements. If you look at critical infrastructure regulations, then they are adding to that. And then there's all the privacy stuff. When we look at GDPR, when we look at CCPA and other regulations in that space, they are very clearly about data protection. They are about understanding where your data resides and protecting that data. So we need it here. And that's also where we see a significant uptake of data-centric security, just driven by regulations such as GDPR and recently then CCPA. We have it as a business regulation. So business regulations are very frequently about protecting financial data and or intellectual property. And then there are a couple of local and global ones. So there are many regulations, and many of these are focusing on data security. I just listed a few. We just recently compiled a list of, I think, more than 100 regulations globally, which deal way north of 100 regulations, which deal with data security requirements. So there are regulations everywhere, but it's not only about regulations. We should go one step further and say we do it because we want to be safe. And before I hand over to Vishal, I want to quickly touch the the CCPA and GDPR perspective, where it becomes apparent that regulations require such a data-centric security approach. So one thing, when we look at both of these, they are not a similar thing. So there are differences. CCPA has a wider range of types of personal data, and there are predefined additional obligations here you need to keep. And some things are different. Some things are strong in GDPR and broader in GDPR, some in CCPA. So there will be more of these. So there are certain role models. There are certain good examples of other countries following the entire thing. But when we look at what it means, then all of these regulations are around understanding your requirements regarding security, legal regulatory requirements. You need to understand them, including the GDPR and or CCPA requirements. It's also important to give your customer the trust and the privacy the customer expects. And what you need to do for that is that you have, and that's why I highlighted this, that you establish a sound data privacy strategy that takes these requirements into account. So you need to understand where's the data, where's the sensitive data, where does it reside. That's one of the samples where it's about also data-centric security. It's about understanding where's the data, how to protect it, how to secure it. Have a plan for implementing it, and understand where it is, categorize it, classify the information, and apply protection on that information. And then obviously you have some things which are more specific around the standards. So put the right technologies in place, train your employees on that, and initiate your data classification recording process, depending, so forget about a date, depending on which regulations you look at, but latest right after that webinar. So do it, enforce it. And this is one of the many examples where it's about, yes, we need data-centric security. Another good example is intellectual property in manufacturing organizations. For manufacturing organizations, I'm from Germany, I'm from the south of Germany, and there are many businesses which are more medium-sized to mid-market, but they are global leaders in a very specific area. So they are high-tech, and obviously their corporate value is derived from their knowledge about from their technology, from their blueprints, from all these intellectual properties, and that's what are their crown jewels. That's what they need to protect. And again, they have a need for data-centric security because they can't afford losing that. So we need data-centric security, and it's logical to start with data-centric security. And with that, I hand over to Vishal, who will go more into detail here.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Appreciate that. Okay, thanks a lot for the background, Martin. And I'll just jump right into what our experience at Seclor has been around building and deploying data-centric security solutions. So the first thing that comes to mind is why now? I mean, data-centric security technologies, or the need for data-centric security for most part, is not particularly new. The earliest versions of such technologies have been around for the better part of last 2 decades, 1999 timeframe. But there are a couple of reasons that in the last 3 or 4 years, increased amount of interest and therefore increased number of deployments, especially when it comes to large enterprises, are being seen for this class of technologies. And there are a couple of external factors which are driving this. So the first one is increased collaboration with external agencies. So most enterprise security postures focus on protecting data and making sure it doesn't leave the enterprise. But with increased collaboration with external agencies like vendors, partners, distributors, customers, lawyers, auditors, board members, and the list goes on. As soon as information or data is sent to them, pretty much every enterprise security technology process breaks down, and the only thing which governs that data now is a non-disclosure agreement, right? And that's not good enough. Combined with that is even people within the enterprise are starting to work from anywhere, from homes, any device, any network, any application kind of things. Increased amount of collaboration and data is moving to cloud applications, which presumably enterprise exercise lesser control over. Martin, you talked about the data-centric nature of regulations. So it's GDPR, and D is for data. And regulations are catching up to becoming more and more data-centric. And there is one kind of internal reason, which is that the technology itself has evolved significantly. A lot of prerequisites around this technology, which were not in place 20 years ago, have now over a period of time come into place. So for example, just basic identity infrastructure is a prerequisite for any data-centric security technology to really work. And of course, security and privacy policy awareness, right? So all of these combined together are creating what I call a perfect storm for data-centric security today. Right? So before we go too far, let's just understand what does data-centric security really mean, on the ground. So data-centric security at the core of it is an answer to these 4 questions. Who can access a piece of information? What can each of the people who can access do with that piece of information? How long can they continue to access it, and from where? So you might have a forward-looking financial statement which can only be accessed by the board and the external auditor. That is the answer to the who question. People can only view and edit it and circulate it amongst themselves, but not copy it out or send it outside of the group, not take printouts and the likes. They can continue to access it till the time these results are published in the stock market. And let's say they can only access it within the European Union, but not outside. Right now, all of this security policies are built into information itself. And that's really what makes this technology data-centric, which is that these security policies are not applied to devices, networks, or applications, but they are applied to data itself. And the policies travel with the data wherever the data goes. Right? These controls are very granular, and we'll see some examples of what these controls look like. They are persistent, which means that in the simplest example, if I send you a document and then you make copies of it and you make version 1 to version 2 and so on, these controls travel with the data. And the last but not the least is that these controls are remotely editable, which means that you can change any of the answers to who, what, when, and where post distribution. Right? So that's one thing around making security itself data-centric and attaching it to data rather than attaching it to networks, applications, or devices. And then combined with that is data-centric audits, which is not only can you attach the security policy, the who, what, when, and where to data, but as this data is going around within the enterprise to external agencies and so on, you can also track and audit who did what with this information, when, and from where. Right? So as this data moves around within the enterprise, goes to an external fabricator for fabrication of a part, comes back into the company, and so on, what exactly is happening to data through its life cycle, authorized access, unauthorized attempts are all getting captured and reported into a central console. And there are very interesting things that can be done around this. Right? And just very quickly, this is what it looks like, right? So you can have controls over who can access, people, teams, what can each of these people do, and I'll scroll through and these controls can get really granular, including controls over screen capture, for example, or running macros in Excel and the likes, right? How many days, time-based controls, IP address, location-based controls, and so on. And as this data moves around within the enterprise, the lowest level of granular data capturing, and then aggregates of this data. So for example, high risk unauthorized activities, which might be for highly confidential intellectual property or forward looking financial statements or shareholder contracts and so on, can then be monitored so that it's not, every piece of data is not treated equally. This technology has been around for many decades, as I mentioned earlier, but there have been reasons for its failure in large-scale adoption. So the technology, the data-centric security technology has succeeded only in very small, defined use cases, but not for business as usual. Right? And those small defined use cases may be, a merger or acquisition kind of scenario where there's a very small group of people who are involved in, very highly confidential activities and so on. So at that scale, the technology has succeeded historically, but not for, let's say, 100,000 people using it on a daily basis. Right? And the biggest reasons for this are around user involvement. The challenge with data-centric security technologies historically has been the need for an average user to be involved in a security process. And that's a big challenge. Educating, driving adoption based on user enthusiasm and user awareness for any technology is a problem. And for security technologies, it's an even bigger problem. This combined with the users having to decide what to protect, what policies to apply to this piece of data that they're creating or they're sending as an email and so on, that increases the costs and the overheads of this. Combined with that has been user experience. So the technologies in this space have historically been format, application, even operating system dependent. So what works for Word and Excel doesn't work for PDF, and what works for Windows doesn't work for Android and the likes. Right. So it's usually been very clunky user experience that has stopped large scale adoption of this technology. Now, combined with that is administrator level overheads. Security teams are getting increasingly, bombarded with more and more requests for tools and technologies. And what happens is that now data-centric security is another tool which needs to be managed, where security policies need to be defined and so on. And of course, the user training and awareness piece has to be done. And this creates nonlinear administrative overheads, which go up exponentially as the size of the enterprise increases. A lot of technologies in the space also have hidden costs because of the format, application, and operating system dependence. What works for Windows 10 will not work for Windows 7, and what works for Office version 13 will not work for Office version 7, and so on. So the prerequisites for using this kind of technology increase, so that you have to spend $1 million on upgrades before you can spend $100,000 on the data-centric security technology itself. Right? And the last but not the least is because data-centric security technologies fundamentally are embedded into the data itself, a document or an email and so on, there are many cases of other technologies breaking down. So deduplication, for example, or content inspection technologies and so on, other technologies breaking down has been a very common phenomenon in this space. And these are all the reasons that for the better part of the last 20 years, this class of technologies has not seen large scale adoption till about 2 or 3 years ago. So in this context, what's the dream scenario for data-centric security technology is, the first one is to remove the user and administrative overheads through a process of automation. Right? So this is almost like a driverless car dream, where the user and the administrator is not burdened with making decisions around what needs to be protected, what policy needs to be applied, and so on. Right? The car pretty much drives itself. Right? That's a dream scenario, and I'll come to how more recent advances in this space have overcome some of these challenges and come very close to a driverless car. The second is how can this technology be deployed without any change in the user experience? So if Martin is creating a document, saving it on his local computer, attaching it to an email, and sending it to the external fabricator, yesterday post deployment of this technology, he should ideally continue to do the same, run the same process, and the technology should just work in the background, which means that it should work with any form of collaboration. It should work on any operating system, any application, any format, and so on. And it should also not force him to upgrade to the latest version of the application or the operating system, or change the workflow in any way. Right now, this is a dream scenario. And what has happened is that in more recent times, this dream scenario is actually playing out, because a lot of technologies all combined together have been able to achieve this dream scenario without, such that the user and the administrator can stop worrying about this technology and are not burdened with making this decision. And also the technology works without any changes in user experience. Right now, before we go ahead a little more into talking about those, what kind of innovation has happened in the last couple of years specifically, let's just look at what really drives the need for this kind of technology. And Martin already covered that earlier in his talk. So the first general class of reasons that enterprises adopt data-centric security is data protection itself. Right, so enterprises are worried about insider threat. What happens if somebody emails a confidential document across. Application data. So for example, what happens if I expose my applications to the external agencies or even to internal users, and somebody downloads a highly confidential document from SharePoint, or somebody extracts a highly confidential report from SAP. DLP extensions. So for example, DLP technologies typically govern the data only till it is within the enterprise, but you want to extend controls of the DLP system outside of the enterprise. IP protection, the example that Martin gave. Email, of course, being the dominant form of collaboration. Right? So the general class of data protection as a driver. The next is external collaboration, right? So whether it is external applications, so you're worried about data going to the cloud, or data going on personal mobile devices. People are working from anywhere, and again, it is very difficult, nearly impossible to control locations or networks or devices and so on. A lot of data goes to external agencies, outsourcing, and the general class of third-party risk. So there is one set of drivers here which are around data protection. There's a second set of drivers which are all around as enterprises lose control of the infrastructure, whether it's the applications going to the cloud or the devices becoming personal or the networks becoming public. How does an enterprise still secure and control this data? And the last but not the least dominant reason for adoption of data-centric security is all the privacy and security regulation which are coming up, and every 4-letter combination is a security regulation or a privacy regulation somewhere in this world, and Martin already talked about that. But today, things like the right to forget, protecting customer data before it even comes to the enterprise and so on, those are big drivers where enterprises have no option but to take a data-centric approach to security. So in an ideal situation, what a data-centric security architecture looks like is data needs to be discovered and tagged, and then rights management, which is once you've discovered and segregated data into this is public information and this is highly confidential intellectual property, and maybe there are shades in the middle. Then appropriate security policies, which is the answer to who, what, when, and where, needs to be applied to each piece of data. Right? And last but not the least, there is data-centric audits, which will now monitor once the data security policy has been applied to the data, and as the data goes around within or outside of the enterprise, there are dashboard which can monitor what is happening to the data, and it can reveal very interesting trends around how this data is being consumed, authorized attempts, unauthorized attempts, and so on. But very important in this scheme of things is that data-centric security is not an island, whether it's an element of IT infrastructure or as a part of the general security posture of an enterprise. And therefore, in our experience, what is very important is for any data-centric security technology to work very well with the existing IT infrastructure of an enterprise. So this is typically data repositories. So this could be repositories of unstructured data like SAP, for example, or an online banking system, the transactional backbone of the company. And these could also be repositories of unstructured information like file servers and SharePoint and Box and so on. Irrespective of what is the nature of that repository of data, the data-centric security infrastructure just needs to work very well with the existing technologies. The second thing is messaging and collaboration. Of course, email being the dominant form, but there are other messaging and collaboration tools, project management kind of tools that are coming up, and the data-centric security technologies need to work with that. Endpoint and other security technologies like DLP, for example, single sign-on identity. And last but not the least, the insights that data-centric security technologies get, like who did what with this piece of data, when and where, is very interesting input for all the security incident and event monitoring, SIEM kind of technologies. But in general, any kind of security analytics that is performed has to start incorporating what is happening to the data itself, because that's probably the most important piece of information that an enterprise can have. Right? So in an ideal situation, the data-centric security infrastructure, which combines, discovery and labeling, rights management, and data-centric audits, needs to work with all these existing existing IT infrastructure that is typically already there within the enterprise. Now, modern day technologies have come around this historical challenges using two key mantras. One is automation, and the second is what we call at secular anyness, right? And let me talk about these two separately. So we talked about the challenges that that user and administrative involvement has, right? If a user is supposed to decide what needs to be protected, what policy needs to be applied, and so on, then chances are that if there are, let's say, 100,000 people within the company, then 100,000 people need to be enabled, trained to make these decisions. And that becomes such a big awareness exercise that the project almost never takes off. Right? So one option here is, for example, the users to manually protect the documents, the emails, documents, whatever piece of data that they are that needs to be protected. But there are various levels of automation. So a piece of data can also be protected as soon as it's extracted from a system. So a report coming out of SAP, for example, or as soon as it's placed in a specific folder on a file server or a SharePoint location or box and so on, or as soon as it is discovered by a DLP system, or as soon as it is emailed and so on. So there are various events in the history in the life cycle of the data which can trigger automated protection without a user taking the initiative. And if you just translate this into, what are the levels of decision making that the user has to do, right? So the first thing is the user has to decide what to protect. In a day, the user might be sending lunch invitations to his colleague and may also be dealing with highly confidential intellectual property. And historically, the older solutions have got the user to decide what needs to be protected. Now, with newer solutions, and Secular is part of this category, we have newer age technologies have been able to get around this challenge and get more and more automation around DLP systems, CASB systems, for example, or even a transactional backbone system like ERP, making a decision around what data needs to be protected. Because for example, SAP already knows that this report which is being extracted contains highly confidential general ledger data, and therefore it should be protected. Right? For that, no other input is required, and a user decision is not required in this case. The second is who should have rights or who should have access to this piece of information. And again, this is, and what rights and policies need to be applied. And this is again not a new question. A file server or SharePoint, any form of collaboration, there are already access control policies defined, and those same access control policies can be applied to this data when it flows out of that system. Of course, there is combined with whatever these rights and policies are not static. So as a piece of information moves through a workflow, their rights and policies can change. And therefore, number one, how to evolve these policies, and then all this audit data that is coming in, right? Who did what with this information, when and where, can also be overwhelming information for the user, and therefore integrations with security analytics tools, SIEMs, and systems, and so on, can take over that function. So overall, all the things where a user needs to be involved historically have been removed with modern day technologies. The net effect of this is that whereas historically these solutions were dependent on people to take initiatives, with all of these integrations and automation, there are step jumps in this adoption that can happen. So for example, the day the system goes live, all the documents in SharePoint can get protected, and a week later, all the documents in all the file servers or box folders which an enterprise is using gets protected, and 2 weeks later, all the reports coming out of the CRM system which contain customer data can get protected. Now, all of this is happening without end users taking any initiative, and that automation is the key aspect of making this kind of technology a success. Right. From a cost of ownership perspective, the biggest line item of cost is the administrative overheads and the user enablement and support fees, right? Historically, and historically, that's what has been the cost factor and the overhead that has stopped large-scale adoption. But with all of this automation, these administrative and user overheads have been reduced down to the minimum, nearly zero in most cases. And that's what is leading to large-scale success of this class of technologies. And combined with this automation is this whole concept of anyness, where the technology works for any format, any operating system. It doesn't require an agent to be installed. That's very important. Is very friendly for external users. So for example, if there is a customer, if there's an enterprise who's using a system, that enterprise's customers should not be forced to jump through hoops or download and install agents for them to get access to the data. And all in all, it means the native experience of working with data should continue. And these goals of automation and what we call anyness have been achieved in modern day technology. There's a lot of innovation that has happened in this space. Secure itself has brought in most of these innovation that has happened in this space to enterprises all over the world. Yeah. So in conclusion, I think I'm a minute away from my time here. In conclusion, what I would encourage everybody here to look at is, number one, take a data-centric approach to security, because very quickly you're going to be out of options of how to secure and make sure that the data remains private. And the second thing is, for any large-scale deployment of this technology, focus on automation and anyness. Thanks a lot. I'll close that my talk. Martin, back to you.
Thank you, Vishal, for this insight you provided, all the information. Let's directly start with the Q&A. And I already have a couple of questions here, and to the audience, feel free to enter additional questions. So the first question I'd like to start with is, the question is, definition of classification of your data is an important step. How many levels of classifications would you create, and how would you deal with personal data not used in a corporate capacity? So for instance, personal data used in personal communication. Vishal, what is your position on that?
I break this problem down into two parts. Number one is data that is being created by users, by end users themselves, and over there it has to be something really simple. I won't go anywhere beyond 5. Even 5 is a stretch. Typically, our advice to most enterprises is to limit the classifications of data down to 3, right? But the same answer for system generated data is very different, because systems, the example that I was running earlier, that systems like SAP or SharePoint already know what is the confidentiality of the data, and number two, who should have even access to this data. So system generated data or system extracted data can be very, very granular without having any overhead for the user. So for example, and maybe I'm repeating here, if I already know that the CRM system is exporting reports which contain customer data, I can very granularly classify that data to customer data, which this report contains customer data, and this customer data is related to customers in Germany, for example, and this should be covered under GDPR and so on. Now, I don't need any user to tell me, because I already know all of this data. So user generated data, very simple, 3 to 5 levels of classification. System generated data or system extracted data can be very, very granular, hundreds, thousands of classifications, and none of these the user needs to be aware of. Martin?
Okay, thank you. Another question here is, do you recommend a Big Bang approach to deploying data-centric security, or should it start with specific use cases?
I think for most enterprises, the choice of the technology has to have a vision for large-scale deployments, so that the choice of the technology itself cannot be driven by 1 or 2 use cases. However, the deployment itself should be, 1 or 2 use cases, whatever is the hotspot at this point of time, and that hotspot can change and evolve over a period of time. So today's problem might be customer data and, let's say, intellectual property protection, and maybe tomorrow's problems can be board communication and and something else. So these use cases can evolve, but the choice and the vision has to be Big Bang.
Okay. So there's another question. Do you think data-centric security can be used to replace other security technologies? So when we look at these circles I started with at the beginning, with data-centric security being at the core, should a company have all the layers, or can they replace something when shifting to data-centric security? What is your perspective on that?
It is data-centric security typically replaces a few other security technologies which are out there, but not all. So the quick answer is yes, it can be used to replace. For example, I can talk through a couple of use cases. For example, one of the largest customers for Seclor, their main concern around allowing personal mobile devices was not really to govern the mobile device itself, as much of it was to govern the data which is going on the personal mobile device. And in that sense, as the enterprise was able to make sure that any data reaching that personal mobile device is secure protected, and therefore the need for a traditional mobile device management, mobile security kind of system went away. Now, this is not to say that what data-centric security does will replace everything that a mobile device management kind of technology does. But if the use case is such that the primary objective is protecting data, then it can replace it.
Okay. One more question we have. Let's pick the last one. What kind of scenarios drive the initial use of data-centric security?
I kind of answered this question, towards the end of my talk, but I would broadly classify this into data protection initiatives, third-party risk, where enterprises are worried about data going to external agencies of all kinds, and of course, security and privacy compliance kind of norms. Now, second and third are kind of obvious here. You're worried about data going to external agencies, and you're worried about some kind of regulatory agency coming after the enterprise. But the first one, which is data protection initiative, that is very broad. It could be intellectual property protection. In one case of, again, one of our customers, it was just to prevent insider trading because forward-looking financial statements were being leaked, and that leaked information was being used to trade on the company's stock. So those kind of use cases can also drive data-centric security adoption.
Okay, great. It looks like we don't have any further questions. So with that, thank you very much to all attendees of today's KuppingerCole webinar. Thank you to you, Vishal, and to Seclor for supporting this KuppingerCole webinar. Have a nice day, and hopefully see you soon at one of our on-site events or one of our virtual offerings we have, including our webinars, masterclasses, etc. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martin. It's a pleasure.